That was first. We didn't rehearse this at all. Oh man, yeah, it's coming Wednesday, isn't it great? You're a blessing. Oh man, it's good to be with you. So, have you heard this one? Famous last words, right? This is the Rednecks' famous last words. Hey guys, watch this! I don't know, I thought I'd try it out. I've always liked that one. It works good here. I'm going to try it out in Indiana too. No, man, famous last words. Like the last word's kind of an important thing, right? You really, is this like, I feel like I'm in a tin can. Is that just me? I can get over it. No, sorry. But really, famous last words. I mean, the last words that we use at the end of our life seem to hold a resonance. They contain something, don't they? And they're going to carry on. And so I've been thinking about last words here lately as we come to this, like, for us, an end of 8 years together here with you at Community of Hope. It's been amazing. But in thinking about famous last words, I came across a few that I want you to consider, even beyond, the Rednecks' famous last words. Let's take a look at one. You ready? I am about to, or I'm going to die. Either expression is correct. This was said by Dominique Bourges, the famous French grammarian. Last words, man. That's going out. Next one. Tomorrow I shall no longer be here. Nostradamus. Who knows Nostradamus? Yeah. That was probably the only one he got correct, but you have won, O Galilean, says the Emperor Julian, after having attempted to reverse the official endorsement of Christianity by the Roman Empire. Right? Now, why did I do that? General William Erskine, after jumping from a window. Man. Oh. I really hope mine are better than that, but I have this sneaky suspicion that mine won't be any better than that. When that day comes, I just have a feeling that I can only imagine what mine will be. But as we know, last words hold a prominence, and people pay attention to last words, don't they? And the truth is, most of the time, words just aren't enough to capture what we're trying to say. And I'm coming to realize that today's kind of that event for Tara and I. I kind of alluded to that a second ago, but we just really wanted to say it right, point in the right direction, because you get one last chance to say what God's been laying on your heart. And words just aren't enough, so we're going to try this sermon thing. But anyway, all of that said, no pressure. Here we are. This is quite honestly the first time that Tara and I have ever had a chance to address to do a final address at a congregation. Never done this before, but I've seen my dad do this several times. You've seen him do this once, so those of you who know my dad. I mean, nobody can do it quite like Kim Smith, right?
Right.
I mean, who can get away with delivering the resignation on an Easter Sunday? Seriously. And he did. Now that's real style. But this past year, several people have come up to me and said, hey, you know what I remember is your dad's last sermon here when he talked about hearing the voice of God. There's something impacting about him testifying to what it looks like to hear the voice of God, not only in his own life, but to see the people of God hear it. And it left a lasting impression on some people's hearts. So I guess for me, in typical preacher form, which is a very new thing for me these days, I feel a bit out of my skin. I don't know how to act, and I'm a terrible actor, so I wouldn't know what to do if I did, right? But preachers are supposed to figure out, how these things work. How does the final address work? What is this thing that you're supposed to do? So I've been kind of doing a little research this week and came across a couple of biblical examples. Acts chapter 7 has Stephen, the first martyr for the church. His last address is right there before a group of people who are about to stone him, and his proclamation is one that tells the Jesus story. It's quite a last sermon. Paul, he gave his last one from a prison just before the Roman Empire snuffed him out. So quite frankly, I've got it made. So for Tara and I, the two that we're going to deal with today, the two twin messages that we're going to look at are the message found by Moses and the one delivered through Joshua just before each one of them were about to die. In a minute, Tara's going to talk about Joshua, but I'm going to talk about Moses. And since I see John Vaughn back there, I'm going to tell him. It's really, I know, he's like, oh man, I can't believe this. John Vaughn always cracks me up because he says, I don't come into this with like any biblical background. When I became a Christian, I didn't know. All I knew about Moses was that he was Charlton Heston. And I love the honesty. And so, John, for your benefit, we're talking about Charlton Heston this morning. But we know Moses, right? Moses was a pretty important guy. He's the one who leads God's people out of Egypt, leads them through the Red Sea on dry ground as God parts the waters, okay? Moses is the one with the stone tablets, the Ten Commandments, remember? Moses was the one who tromped around the desert with the Israelites and got to know them all too well. I think better than he really wanted to. And what we discover about this journey of Moses with these Israelite people is it wasn't so much about where they were going, which was the promised land. It was more about who they were following. I mean, that was the deal. Everybody was excited about the promised land and where they were going and what they were going to do when they got there. But the message was, who are you following on your way? So we find in Deuteronomy chapter 30, Moses and God's people, again in the wilderness, but this time they're looking out over the Jordan River, facing the promised land, and they're saying, oh, okay. The thing about it is, Moses knows he's about to die, so he's thinking about, how am I going to address these people? What do I tell them as I know they're about to enter this land that God is going to give them? Let me tell you that his last sermon in those last few chapters of Deuteronomy, they're like serious business. And I've grown up in the church and I've heard saints in the church say, oh man, sometimes I just want to hear a preacher give a good foot stomping. I don't even feel like I've been to church unless I'm getting my toes stomped on by the preacher. Preachers these days don't even do that anymore. It's unfortunate. I've heard this. I chuckle a little, but like really, as I read this, I thought, wow, Moses was like stomping on some toes. He meant business. He gets into this in chapter 28, 30. He starts talking about all the curses and all of the blessings. And I mean, the curses are serious business. When you get over to the promised land, here's what's waiting for you. Curses and there's blessings. So Israelite people, you had a choice to make. What you're going to do when you get there. Moses, I think he was curmudgeonly, You know that word, curmudgeonly? A little, sort of angry. At this point, old. Frustrated. I think he was saying, well, he did say, he called these people stiff-necked. He said, you're a stiff-necked people. And he gave them this final vote of confidence. When you get over the promised land, guess what's going to happen? You're going to fail. I've seen too much. 40 years in the desert and all the years around it. You're going to blow it. So, here you go. But in the midst of all of that, in the prediction that they're going to fail, Moses is trying to give them something to hold on to, right? And so he gives them this basic reality, this principle he's calling them to remember and to tell. Moses wants them to come away after all the truth he's going to lay out in front of them. All he wants them to do is remember and tell. In Deuteronomy 32:7, I think we've got it on the screen. He says, "Remember the days of old, consider generations long past. Ask your father and he will tell you, your elders and they will explain to you." So what exactly does it mean to remember and tell? Well, for the Israelite people, Moses' message to them was, guys, remember, you were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. You were trapped in there without hope, overpowered and overwhelmed. And God heard your cry and delivered you. He says, remember, Israel, that God was your God in slavery in the face of annihilation at the Red Sea. So even after God delivers you from Egypt, you find yourself pinned against the Red Sea and you're about to be annihilated again. Remember that God parted the sea for you. Remember that God was your God in the desert in the times of wandering without food and water. And remember, O Israel, that there will be temptation to worship golden calves and fight your own battles in the face of powerful enemies. And then he says, after you remember all of this, I want you to tell your children, and I want you to tell your children's children so that they will know the kind of God who holds a covenant with you. Now let me be clear. Moses again reassures them that they will be wayward and they will break the covenant and they're going to fail. Man. So Moses' best advice to them is, guys, don't stop telling the stories. Don't stop testifying to what God has done and to what you couldn't do. So, we're grafted in. Community of Hope. We're Jesus followers. As the New Testament tells us, these folks that came along were grafted into this Israelite story. So this address from Moses to the Israelite people, this is for us too. So what does it look like for me and you here at Community of Hope? This call to remember and this call to tell. Well, remember that you were once content as a slave to pornography and alcohol. You were once a slave to every other hurt, habit, and hang-up that one could possibly imagine. And remember that God met you in that place of powerlessness. And He led you step by step out of Egypt. Right? Remember that you were addicted to, you were a slave to that relationship that was so intoxicating that you were convinced it was the only place that your worth could be found. And so tell your children all of these things. Tell them the story. When the time is right and they're ready to hear it, tell them. Tell them so that they will know how to cry out to God for deliverance. Remember that time when your marriage was on the fritz, when everything was about to fail. Remember the fear that compelled you to cry out, Lord, free us. Remember that God came to rescue you. Or maybe you need to remember that divorce that unfolded as the marriage collapsed. Maybe you need to remember the pain. Maybe you need to remember the shame. and the way that that stuff grips us even still. Maybe you need to remember this so that you can tell the story of what God did to restore you back to trust. Tell these stories over and over and over again so that your story can be heard by your kids, so that your church can hear your story. And they can be reminded of what it looks like when God intervenes in that place. Maybe you need to remember the great loss that you've suffered in life. Maybe it was a pregnancy that didn't come to term. Maybe it was the sadness of a lost loved one. Tell about the grief. Tell the generations about what it looked like to walk with God in the desert. And tell how He provides in the desert. Because only God can provide in that desert, in that wasteland. But how will the next generation know if we don't tell them? Right? And so remember that you were once a slave to unforgiveness. You know how unforgiveness works. It rules our heart. And it makes it impossible for relationships to be free and full. Remember what it was like to cry out, and remember that God met you there in that place of slavery. Have you ever worked hard to hold somebody in a place of unforgiveness? Who's really bound in that? Right? So tell about the way that the enemy of unforgiveness lurks like an enemy in a foreign land, just waiting to pounce on you when you least expect it. And tell the story of how God conquered the enemy, even though you were outnumbered and powerless to forgive on your own. And so one more, remember that you were once a slave to pride and arrogance. Remember that you did its bidding. And you were enthusiastic about it. Remember how your gossip, that thing that you intended to hold other people in their place, remember how it made prisons for those around you and yourself. Remember what it looked like when you were confronted by your own unworthiness. And God met you there and led you into real freedom. And tell it. Tell the story of what God's faithfulness looks like in that. So right now what I'm telling you here is that Moses is saying, remember and tell. You know what that means? Testify, church. Just testify. Give your testimony. Because you have a story of slavery and bondage. I don't know what yours is. But you also have a story of God intervening. We remember and we tell because, as Moses predicts, we're going to fail at this. He tells us to tell our children because they're going to be enslaved too. Moses isn't some kind of fortune teller. He just knows the story. And he knows that even though these kids are going to find themselves in the promised land, what's going to happen? They're going to get comfortable. And slavery is going to overpower them, even in the promised land. So please, tell your stories, your wisdom, and the truth. Even the shameful truth. Even the not so glorious wayward moments. Tell it. Because it's not about you. It's about God's glory. And how God works in this world. The call is to remember slavery and oppression. So for me, with my own kids, I know that as hard as I'm going to work to raise them up, I want to raise them up in the Nazarene church like I was raised up because it was a good place. I know that slavery is going to visit them no matter what the promised land looks like and how I arrange it for them. It is. And so Moses' message to me is, Remember and tell. And I hope that the testimony of my life, that as I share it with them, they will learn about the God who carries their burdens and their failures. About the God who upholds and redeems their life. My hope is that my own story of slavery and my testimony of deliverance will be reflective of a God who leads me to freedom, and that it's the same God that leads them and speaks to them. And I hope that they learn from my story just as the Israelites learned. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will never leave them nor forsake them, no matter how wayward or burdened they find themselves to be. So, rebellious and stiff-necked people, testify.
Strange. Oh, yeah, that's right.
Lost my balance. This is kind of a strange thing to do, a two-part sermon, but like we said, this is sort of our tale of two sermons. We good on the sound? Can you hear me okay? We're working on it. All right. Brett got a chance to tell you about Moses, and I want to tell you about Joshua. Now, here's the neat thing about Scripture. When the Bible really wants to hammer home a point about something, sometimes it'll tell the same story 2, 3, 4 times in a row. And if you pay attention to those times, if you look for the details and the differences, God's really going to talk to you in those places. And sometimes Scripture will tell the same story one after another, but in totally different ways, like in Genesis 1 and 2. Or sometimes it's more like the 4 Gospels, where you sort of get different angles on the same events. Well, when you get to the end of Deuteronomy, and if you're just feeling crazy and you decide to sit down and read through all the book of Joshua too, and you do that in one setting, you're going to see a sense of deja vu. Joshua is like Moses part 2. Joshua, when he gets to the end of his life, he preaches his last sermon, and it sounds really, really similar to what we heard from Moses a generation before. But let's try to put this in context a little bit. So at the end of Moses' life, he gathers all of Israel together in the plains of Moab, east of the Jordan River. And if they look out across the Jordan, they can see the promised land on the other side. They're hungry for the promised land, but they're not there yet. The mountains and the hills are just beyond on the other side. They can almost taste the milk and honey. But all they had for breakfast that morning was manna, again. And so it is with great and difficult patience that they listen to their elder Moses with his protege Joshua by his side as he tells them to remember their story. But they do listen because this is his last sermon, and we pay special attention to people's last words. So he tells them their story, and he asks them to remember and to tell it to their children. So, a generation later, they've crossed over into the promised land, and they've experienced life in the promised land. And some of the experiences have been good, and some of the experiences have been bad, but they've been there in the promised land for a generation now. They've crossed over that spiritual boundary, and they are living in it. And when they gather together with Joshua at the end of his life, all of Israel gathers in the valley of Shechem. And they're west of the Jordan River. And if they look behind them, they can see the plains of Moab where so many of their parents are buried, if they even cared to look back there. But they don't really want to because their bellies are full of milk and honey. And to be honest, they would just kind of rather go home and watch football this afternoon. But it is with great and difficult patience that they gather together to listen to their elder Joshua as he reminds them of their story. But we listen to people because this is his last sermon, and we pay special attention to people's last words. So they do listen. And Joshua tells them to remember and to tell. But the tricky thing is, this is a generation later, and there's more to it than just that. This call to remember and tell is situated in the context of a particular story. You don't just remember and tell any old story you want to. The story that you remember and tell is always situated in the covenant between God and God's people. You say that one more time. The story that we remember and that we tell is the story that lives in the covenant between God and God's people. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, this is a tricky thing. There are an awful lot of ways that we can go wrong with this. So Joshua is really careful to say two equally important but equally contradictory things at the same time. And he gets this from Moses, who a generation before said two equally important and equally contradictory things. And he says it like this, and we don't have time to go through all of it, but later on this week, don't just trust me on this. Go through sometime and read the last several chapters of Deuteronomy and the last several chapters of Joshua. And you'll see two truths start to emerge that are both equally true, equally opposite. First of all, this is about you. It matters what you do. It matters who you are. It matters what you choose. It matters the kind of life you lead. It matters who you worship. It matters who you show love to, who you show compassion to. It matters who you show justice to. It matters the songs you sing, and it matters the kinds of stories that you tell and the way that you tell them. This is about you, and it matters what you do. That's the first truth. The second truth is, this is not about you. Did you think this was about you? This is not about you. You are a stiff-necked, rebellious son of a wandering Aramaean. And you know that. And God knows that. And God knew that before you even came here to hear this last sermon. This is not about you. This is about God. This is about the God who delivers you. It would take a miracle, a literal act of God, for you to choose the life of blessing that God lays out before you through the last sermons of Moses or Joshua. Both things, both equally true, both at the same time. And that is how we have to talk about what it means to be a people who participate in the covenant between God and God's people. Now you're going to have to go read Moses for yourself. Here's how Joshua does it. He is about to die. He gathers all of Israel together for one last sermon. He's 110 years old, but he brings it. This is a great sermon. This is a powerful message at the end of his life. He has got them hooked on his every word. He reminds them of their battles that they fought. He inspires them to faithfulness. They are with every word that he says. And at the end of the sermon, he culminates in that one verse that I know 50% of us have hanging somewhere in our homes right now. Choose this day who you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Wow. That's good stuff. That's how you preach a sermon. That's how you end a sermon. Right there is where you end your sermon. That's where you drop the mic and you walk off the stage. I haven't been preaching that long, but I know that is the point where you call Tony on stage to start singing, I have decided to follow Jesus. That's how you end a sermon. But that's not what Joshua does. Now the people are moved. They're there. It worked. This worked. The sermon's over. This worked. And they have decided. In verse 18 they say, we too will worship the Lord because he is our God. Yes, this is great. And now let me set the scene for you. This is like an old Billy Graham crusade, okay? When Billy Graham used to come to town, and he would set up in the biggest stadium in town, and thousands of people would come to hear his message. And this moment is kind of like those thousands of people in the stadiums have gotten to the altar call, and at like one motion, they all get up, and they're rushing towards the altar, and they are ready to commit. And what Joshua does at the end of this sermon is the same as if Billy Graham were to, in that moment, say, stop, just stop. Stop the music, go back to your seats, sit down, just cut it out. You don't mean this. This is what Joshua does. In verse 19, the people have just said, we will serve the Lord. As for our houses, we will serve the Lord too. And Joshua says, you will not be able to worship the Lord because he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not remove your transgressions and sins. Does yours say that too? That can't be right. That doesn't sound right. This is so not where we thought he was going with this. Now, I don't want to ruin for you the picture that you have hanging somewhere in your house. But I do hope that you remember every time you walk by it and see, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That if you were to say too confidently, amen, I'm going to do that too, then Joshua, he would have some questions for you. He would look at you and say, and no. No, you can't. You can't do that. If participating in the covenant between God and God's people is about your resolve and your inner strength, then I'm sorry. It is not going to work. Centuries later, Jesus would call this cleaning up the outside of the cup and leaving the inside filthy. So where does that leave us? Well, I'd say it leaves us in the tension between two truths, equal and opposite. This is about you, and it matters very much what you do and what you choose to do. And this is not about you. This is about God, and that God has promised to deliver you. And I am very sorry to say that this is where Joshua leaves us, in that tension. He makes the people of Israel repeat 3 times that they will worship the Lord before he finally lets them have their altar call. And at that point, it's just kind of confusing. And even then, he picks up a stone from the ground and he says, well, this rock heard what we all said here today, so one of these days it's going to testify against us. It's almost as if he's read the rest of the Old Testament and he knows how these people are going to act. Now, I don't know about you, but this last sermon leaves me feeling a little confused. I always thought that preachers were supposed to give you answers for your questions. But Joshua's sermon is all about giving us questions for our answers. If you are pretty confident that you and your household are worshiping the Lord, Joshua would have you stop for a second and ask, where are you placing that confidence? Because if you've forgotten what it was like to be a slave in Egypt, then there is a good chance that you have also forgotten that it was the Lord who delivered you and freed you from that bondage. So if you're going to participate in the covenant between God and God's people, you don't start with confident declarations of your own intentions. You start by remembering and by telling. Now, we've been talking about last sermons. So we've talked about Moses and we've talked about Joshua. But we haven't yet talked about Jesus' last sermon. And that's because Jesus' last sermon was a supper. You might have noticed we have the elements of the Eucharist up front. Eucharist is just a fancy word for the Thanksgiving meal. And this is how, when Jesus comes to the end of his life, instead of taking the time for a last sermon, he takes the time for a last supper. And Brett and I would like very much and would be honored and blessed if our last sermon with you could end with a Last Supper with Jesus. So the way that we do that here is you go to the ends of your aisles and you come around, you'll come up front and you'll take the bread and you'll dip it in the cup and you'll eat it and you will remember. And then you go back to your seats, and then those of us who are serving communion, if you could come on up and begin to prepare the elements. And you'll go back to the seats after that, and we'll give one more final blessing. And we want to invite everyone to come up and join us in this. But as we're getting ready to partake in communion, I want to read to you the words that Paul wrote about the Lord's Supper. And I want you to hear them as if you're hearing them for the first time. On the night that he was betrayed, the Lord Jesus took bread, and he spoke a prayer of thanksgiving. He broke the bread, and he said, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this to remember me." When the supper was over, he did the same with the cup. He said, "This cup is the new promise made with my blood. Every time you drink from it, do it to remember me. Every time you eat this bread and drink from this cup, you tell about the Lord's death until he comes." Come on. It's a tradition of the church, and has been for many centuries, to end gatherings with a blessing. And so if you would, I'd like you to stand for a blessing this morning. John Wesley, at the end of his life, had some time to plan. John Wesley planned everything. He wasn't going to let his death go unplanned. So he figured out his last words, and he wrote it out in advance, and he knew just what he would say, because he knew people would remember it, and they would tell about it. So when what he thought was the end came, he spoke the words that he had worked so careful to craft. "Lord, thou givest strength to those that can speak and to those that cannot. Speak, Lord, to all our hearts and let them know that thou loosest tongues." Now that sounded nice, but the problem was, he didn't die. This was a problem for John Wesley, who planned everything out just right. So he lingered on a little further, going in and out of consciousness. And then for one last moment, before he left this earth forever, he woke up just enough, and he half sat up, and he raised his hands, and what he said is a blessing to us this morning. Best of all, friends, oh, best of all, God is with us. Amen. You're dismissed.